Hi and welcome back. This is Lecture 5. Up to this point, we've introduced to learning. We've talked about a learning approach that we call learning journals. We have talked about how to read before you come to class, what I call stage 1 of learning journals. We've talked about how to take notes during class. That's that information that's either match information or new information. And we've talked about exam preparation and issues of test anxiety and the like. Now what we're going to do is turn to what for many students is another major academic deficiency or weakness, writing. I'd like to talk in this lecture for a few minutes about how I see most students when they come to me as writers, the kinds of things they do naturally. And then after I have outlined that, I will ask you to maybe consider how much what I say parallels your own academic approach to writing. Then I want to talk about an approach that for me and for many of my students does seem to work for them, what we call jam writing. And I will outline jam writing. I will give you some actual examples of jam writing. And then we'll talk about ways that you can use jam writing in your academic life. And then finally, I will talk about informal writing, as I call it. And I will define informal writing, and I'll give you some idea of how to improve some of the types of informal writing that you have to do. For those of you who are wanting more information on academic writing, and more especially the academic essay, you're going to have to wait one lecture. We'll pick that up then in the next lecture, and we will see these two lectures then as coming together. Okay? Let's talk for a few seconds about how most students write. I can tell you a little story that sets this up nicely. I began doing lecturing and thinking about writing years ago. And as part of that work, I went to middle schools where I would ask students to write for a period of time on their favorite animal. They were, I believe, 7th graders at the time. My interest was not what they said. My interest at the time was more how they approached their writing. Several things happened in every class. First of all, there would be long pause of silence. Someone would start maybe tapping on their pen top, or they would begin to tap on their table. Finally, one student would begin writing. And they would begin at the top of the page, and they would begin to write for a few minutes, when all of a sudden their pen would stop, their eyes would go back up to the top of the page, they would begin to read what they had written, and then they would tear their paper out of their spiral notebook, wad it up, put it on the paper, and they would be back to a white page again with more sighing. Sighing was always kind of an indicator that there was some frustration. I did this for a while, and then I came to a high school writing class of seniors. And I, on the first day of class, walked in and said, "Hi, I'd like for you to write an essay for me briefly on a place you would rather be than here right now." And I thought, this is a simple enough assignment. And I sat down at my desk, and I sat down to write myself. There was a moment of silence. And then from the back of the room, I heard a sigh. And then someone started with pens. And then there was tapping. And within 20 seconds, someone had gone, and I thought, wow, they do it here too. As I've told this story, and I've told it all over the world, and interestingly, I get writing teachers from all over the world, Korea, Japan, all over the world, who say, wow, that's exactly what our students do as well. I think that what happens for most students is that they will start writing, and then I have found that most students stop between the 4th and the 7th line. They're always trying to edit while they write. Now, I think there's a reason for this, and it's what I call the English lie. The English lie is the reason most students stop writing and then go back up to the top of the page and begin to read what it is that they have already written. The English lie is simply, good writing is good grammar. When I, for example, stop a student and I say to them, now why exactly is it that you stopped right then and your eyes went back up to the top of the page? They will look at me as if something's wrong with me, and they will say, I have to get it right. And I ask them, what does that mean, you have to get it right? And they will say, well, you know, I have to get it right so that the teacher will give me a good grade, etc., etc. Good writing is good grammar. The idea that if I somehow can write grammatically correct material, then I will be writing well. It's not true. To prove that writing and editing are in fact two completely different functions, I would recommend this little game. And by the way, you can play this with your friends if you want to. Set someone down, and you can, after I say this, if you want to, turn off the tape and try it yourself to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate. Set someone down and say to them, I would like to do an experiment with you. I want you to write for a while. I'm going to give you a topic, and I want you to write for a while. And when you get to the 5th line, I want you to keep writing. But I'm going to ask you to begin to read out loud what you wrote on the 1st line. Okay? In other words, you're going to begin to write, and then when you get to the 5th line, I want you simultaneously to begin to read out loud what you wrote on the 1st line. Are you ready? Go. And then give an assignment, a topic, a place you'd rather be other than here right now. When they get to the 5th line, ask them if they can read it out loud. You will notice that as remarkable as our minds are, this is a process, two processes together, we cannot do simultaneously. Reading and editing are one process. Writing is an entirely different process. And I think this is why so many students, the tearing out of the paper for me is a signal of major frustration. I think there's another reason why so many students are frustrated in their writing. Many students will go into class and the teacher will say, tonight I want you to go home and to write an essay. And so they go home, they sit down, they look at the paper looks back at them, or they look at the screen looks back at them, and they have to write an essay. Gotta write an essay, gotta write an essay, gotta write an essay. And they try to come up with an essay. I have students, I will overhear them, they will say, I've got to come up with a poem tonight. I've got to come up with a story tonight. What I call this is moving from form to content. I believe it is a major mistake, and I believe it is why so many students struggle in their writing. Let me explain what I mean. Form simply means the type of writing that we're talking about. Essay, story, poem, play, whatever. Many students will begin from the form, and then they try to generate content or idea. And for them, it is majorly, majorly frustrating. Beginning with form is like way too difficult and frustrating, and therefore we are constantly saying things like, this sounds dumb, this sounds stupid. We will say things like, this doesn't look right. Many students will say that to me when they're tearing their paper out, and I'll ask them, wait a minute, why are you getting rid of that draft? It doesn't look right. Okay? Good writing is not good grammar. Good writing, I will define for you now as simply this. Good writing is a good idea. That's good writing, okay? And when we have a good idea, we know that we are onto something. So what we want to do, if you will, is to reverse the process. We will no longer want to write from form to content or idea. Rather, we will want to write from idea to form. Back to the reading and writing example. What would happen if we simply wrote and didn't worry about trying to edit? This is what I call jam writing. It's called lots of other things. You maybe have heard about it as free writing or flow writing. The idea is simply this. Once the pen or pencil starts, and of course you can do it typing as well, we don't stop to review or edit our work. The key, then, is whatever is in our brain goes on to the page. This idea is an interesting one, and it's one that quite a few authors, in fact, employ. Think about a couple of quotes. The great writer E.M. Forster said the following. Look at this quote. He said, "How do I know what I think until I see what I say?" Which is an interesting which is an interesting quote. Look at this quote as well. Robert Frost said, "For me, the initial delight is in the surprise of remembering something I didn't know I knew." What we are doing when we jam write then is simply trying to get our ideas onto the page. Whatever is in our brain goes onto the page. If I don't know what I want to write about, that's what I say. It's important to understand jam writing then is only for you. No one else ever reads this, solely for you. You have total freedom to be able to say anything you want to say. Of course, the other really important thing here can be best understood by a bizarre phenomenon that I notice occurs about all over the world. I'm driving along through the middle of where I live, they're called Badlands, the middle of nowhere, and I am alone in the middle of the night when all of a sudden my car breaks down. Just completely breaks down in the middle of the road. What do most people do? Oh, this is just great. Now what am I going to do? Get out, open up the hood. Oh, what am I supposed to do now? I've always often wanted to come up to someone and say, to whom are you speaking? There's no one else here, right? But we know something. Children, when you watch them play and they're very young, they will talk all the time, right? Even though they're alone. Okay, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to, oh, nope, that didn't work. Oh, I'm going to try, right? Children do this all the time. We know that as we get older, we internalize this kind of dialogue with ourselves, but it's still there. As a matter of fact, there's a whole lot of linguists who suggest that while you are listening to me right now, there's all kinds of stuff going through your head, dialogues, ideas, comments. Jam writing seeks to take all of that, as much of it as we can, and dump it down onto the page. We do not worry about form. We do not worry about grammar. We do not worry about usage issues. We simply put it onto the page. Okay. Specifically now, how do we do jam writing? Once we start writing, our pen doesn't stop for at least 10 minutes. We can be reminded of the, for many of us anyway, the experience of middle school PE, when they took us out on the track and made us run the mile. And we started around the track, and halfway around we decided we were going to die, and so we needed to slow down. And the teacher said, keep going. And we ran for a little while longer, and then we for certain knew that we were going to fall over right there on the track, and our friends would all gather around and go, bummer. So we slowed down. And the coach or teacher said, keep running. But then something strange happened, and we hit what runners often call the second wind, and they just begin to kind of move in a groove. And then you can run for quite some time. Good runners, of course, try to get there quickly. We will find the same thing occurring in jam writing. We will want to write beyond the 7th minute. In my studies with students, at about the 7th minute, most students are convinced they have said everything that they need or can say. And I will ask them to keep going. So when you do your jam writing, you're going to want to make sure that the pen doesn't stop for at least 10 minutes. One of the beauties of this is the ability to surprise yourself, okay? You will oftentimes say things beyond the 7th minute that you don't even know where it came from. It sounds very much like what E.M. Forrester and what Frost were suggesting in their writing. You don't always know. You're not in total control in jam writing, which is one of the reasons that it's so much fun. We don't worry, as I said, about grammar or usage. We let go, we have fun. Let's try an introduction, shall we? We have heard what jam writing is. I would like for you in a moment to stop the tape. I'm going to give a topic, and there's really two types of jam writing. One is focused, the other is non-focused jam writing. And what I want you to do is to do what I call focused jam writing, which is writing on a specific topic. Unfocused jam writing is simply sitting down and writing anything and everything. Focused jam writing allows us to return back to the idea. I'd like you to sit and write for 10 minutes non-stop about the first time you can remember falling in love. Now, wait, before you start going, oh, no, I don't. You got to write it. You don't say it out loud. Turn off the tape, have a sheet of paper in front of you, and whatever is in your brain goes on to the page, whatever. and see if you can write non-stop for 10 minutes. To make sure that you're not going to be cheating and it's truly jam writing, take a piece of paper and cover line by line as you write. Go ahead, turn off the tape, and for 10 minutes write on the first time you can remember falling in love. Okay, how did you do? Did you do jam writing? Let's take a look at an example of jam writing. One of my students, Anna again, was gracious enough to allow for me to show an example of her jam writing on this very topic. She writes, as you will notice as you're looking at it now, she writes jam writing. Notice there's a couple of immediate types of giveaways. One, it's almost always completely or near completely illegible. You're writing as quickly as you can and it's only for you. Two, notice as well that there are no paragraph breaks. No reason for it. All we're doing is simply writing. And here Anna is telling us about a time when in her youth when she fell in love for the first time with Tom Cruise in a movie that she saw of Tom Cruise. You will notice that if you were to read through this, and we won't take much more time with this, but if you were to read through this, you would notice that this is very personal and yet not worrying about any other kinds of issues, grammar, etc. Now, how specifically do we use this kind of writing? We will use jam writing to begin most of our paper writing. We will have a writing process that can be best represented through a flow chart. Once we have ideas from our jam writing, we can go back and read through them and begin to think about what certain ideas work for us. If we wanted to take the time, we could go back with Anna's piece of jam writing and we could find one or two ideas that could then be turned into a piece of poetry, could be used for a possible idea in a short story, could be used as an idea for an essay. So what we're really looking for in our jam writing is the idea. Once we find the idea, then we're ready to think about form. We will use then any number of pieces of jam writing. We don't have to just use one to try and hit on the idea. Once we have the idea, we can create any number of forms with the idea. In my classroom, we will oftentimes take several pieces of jam writing on a topic and we will take the same idea and we can create any number of types of form. Once I have an idea, the form component is much, much easier to do. Once we've decided, then we begin to move to draft one. Once we have draft one taken care of, we have typed it in manuscript style. Notice the graphic that I'm providing for you here called the writing flowchart. We begin with our ideas. We then will move to what oftentimes is called pre-writing. We will, for example, do any number of types of things. Webbing, jot listing, lots of ideas that you can learn in any kind of writing course. If those are ideas that we want to work with, we then create what we call a rough draft. We then ask the question, is this worth improving or even keeping? If it's not, we go back. If it is, then we go to the revision process. We'll have several different types of what we call writing conferences. We will peer edit. We will allow others to see it. We will group edit, maybe more than a single person at a time. And obviously we will allow for the teacher to take a look at it. Finally, we will move then to the final copy and maybe even publishing our piece. Okay, this is an introduction to jam writing. We will see more of this in Lecture 8, where there we will actually observe a student who begins with some jam writing and an idea, and then over a period of 5 days creates a completion project at the end in the form of an academic paper. Okay? So if you have further questions about the outline that I just gave, you'll want to come back with me in the next lecture and then in the 8th lecture to understand better exactly how we do that. I want to talk about now, broadly speaking, 2 types of writing. When we talk about writing, I like to talk about formal versus informal writing. Some people like to use the term creative writing, but I don't like that term, because for me, all writing, if it's writing, is creative, because all writing is thought, and thought is creative. I don't really like to talk about creative writing as a certain type of writing. Instead, I will talk about informal versus formal writing. For the remainder of this lecture, what I want to do is to talk about informal writing, and then in the next lecture, I will talk about formal writing, okay? And as well, editing comments regarding formal writing, and informal as well. We speak of informal writing as that writing which has a broad audience, which might receive different comments, for example, depending upon who sees it. Let me give you an example. I had a student who wrote a poem in my class, and we sent that poem off to several different editors for potential publishing. One of the publishers wrote back and told her that it was one of the finest pieces that he had seen of a high school senior. Another editor wrote back and said that the poem was not worth any kind of publishing. Now, how do you account for the fact that the same work, the same poem, would have such varied responses? This is the nature of informal writing. Any type of writing then is informal if the intended audience is broad and the rules for the writing really do vary with audiences. We should try, when we are writing informal writing, to publish, because we want to experiment with our voice, and we would like to share our voice with others. It is a way for us to validate our voice, and I believe that we should try to publish. It also will provide us with incentive, reason to try and improve our writing. I want to talk now for a few minutes about the different types of informal writing that oftentimes we are either asked to write or maybe we want to write, okay? The first, obviously, I say obviously, most of the time when people think of informal writing, poetry does come to mind. Poetry is one of the more popular forms of informal writing. I want to suggest for those of you who would like to improve your poetry that you will do much better if you begin with a concrete image or picture in your mind. What is it that you wish to describe in detail? And see that picture or that image clearly, and begin actually in jam writing. Don't worry about the form of poetry. Many students who try to write a poem struggle because it doesn't look like a poem. Forget about how it looks, and simply sit down and jam write with as much detail as possible. The way I like to think about poetry is a snapshot or a picture. When the picture is fuzzy, we call that out of focus. In your mind, try to have as clear an image as you can, and then create that image with words. In other words, poetry is picture writing with words. And we want to create the most clear picture that we can. You can always come back after the fact, and you can always construct lines. Once you have the idea again, you can always worry about form. The second type of informal writing I want to talk about is fiction and drama. Obviously, really varied forms of informal writing. There are several ways, though, that writers like to approach their writing. Let me give you examples of a few. One approach is to begin with characterization. For example, you can write some what we call character sketches. Now, the idea here is that you begin by describing a character. You have no idea where this character will be in terms of the setting of a story, and you don't care. You have no idea what kinds of conflicts or fights will be involved for this character, and you don't care. But you have a very clear image in your mind of who this character is. What does this character look like, feel like, think like? And you describe so strongly that character that you can put that character in any number of settings, okay? Any number of situations or conflicts, and you can create storyline. Another way to begin or create ideas for stories, even in your jam writing, is to work from a scene. Now, my wife, if she was a writer, she would probably write this way, because she loves those long novels that are set in Ireland with the castles. Setting is very important to any novel that she reads. Oftentimes, we can play this game. Maybe you've played it before in class, where you all sit in a circle and the teacher says, come up with one really scary place and write it down on a piece of paper. And so you write down 4 or 5 lines of a really scary place, the best scary place you can imagine. And then everyone shifts their paper 1 seat to the left. You immediately look at the scary scene or setting that has been set up for you, and you have 10 minutes to construct a storyline. It is amazing to my students how simple it is for them to do this. Once they have a really scary setting all set up, and the stories just start to come to mind immediately. If you like setting, and you can see setting well, this might be a place for you to begin. A third and final place is the fight or the conflict. Good stories have always some kind of fight or conflict. Many students feel the need to create an original story. Well, the truth is, most of the storylines in terms of conflict have all been taken. But you can always take a conflict and vary it in some way. So while you're watching movies or watching television sitcoms, you can ask yourself, what's the primary fight in this? And how could I use this in a new story that maybe I would be creating? Informal essays involve any time that I write to voice an opinion for a potentially broad audience. Writing for the school newspaper, writing for a local paper, voicing an opinion of some kind or another. We want to always watch our thesis, what it is we're arguing, and how we prove that. And not always just simply write from our own pure emotions, but somehow try to validate our ideas. What I say in the next lecture about essay writing especially will help this understanding. Okay, finally, let's talk for a few minutes about suggestions for improving informal writing. If I really want to improve my poetry or my short fiction writing or my play writing, how exactly can I do that? Let me give a couple of suggestions in closing. First of all, I believe that we need models. We have to be readers if we're going to be writers. Every writer that I know, who I've ever spoken to about what exactly is it that you really recommend for the students that I teach, because I teach writing so much, every one of them will always say the same thing. They have to be readers if they're going to be writers. If you are going to write science fiction short stories, you need to find a model, Asimov for example, and read that model. You have to know that model well. Think about what we do with music. When you get a brand new CD, do you go home, listen to it once, take it out of the CD player, snap it over your knee, throw it away? Only if it's really lousy, right? If it's a good CD, you listen to it over and over. But why? You've already heard it once. Well, it entertains me, maybe, is an answer. Right. We want to do the same thing with books. When we finish reading a book, we want to go back and read it again and again and again. See, this is what we do with good models. The other interesting thing, if you get a good CD, what's one of the first things you always want to do? Go to somebody and say, have you heard? Have you heard? See, we want to do the same thing with books as well. When we read a good book, why not go and share the book with someone and say, I read this great book. This is the value of group study, by the way. You can all share the kinds of books that you're reading. One other suggestion that I would like to make here in closing is a process that I call emulation. The idea here is that you find a poet or a fiction writer or a nonfiction writer who for you is the ideal. When you read them, you know that you're reading what you believe is about the best you've ever read. And you read them and study their writing quite a bit. Then you sit down and you try to emulate. Now this is not imitate. They're not the same. You look at, for example, the way they approach subject. You look at maybe, for example, if your poet model is Whitman, maybe you really like the way that he plays around with lists, and you like that. And so you decide, I'm going to try to write a poem where I do some listing like that. One of the projects that we often do in my classroom is to take one fiction model, one poet model, one non-fiction model for the whole year. And my students will simply read those 3 people for an entire semester. What they find happening is they really do begin to understand just how the writer approaches their writing, and they can begin to emulate. Finally, Just in closing, I want to suggest that there are a couple of ways to improve our short fiction and maybe even our novel writing for those of you out there who see that as a great goal. You want to focus on your use of dialogue, and you want to focus on the development of conflict or fight in the piece. That's going to be at the heart of all of your good short story or novel writing. You want your dialogue to be very real. Go into a bookstore and pick up any best-selling novel, open at random and begin to read the dialogue, and you will notice it always sounds fresh and real, and that's the way that you want to write. Okay, we've introduced jam writing, and we've talked about moving from idea to form. Now, in the second of these 2 lectures on writing, in Lecture 6, I want to talk about formal essay writing. When a teacher gives you an essay at school to write on, what exactly is it they're asking you to do? Come back in a little bit and we'll talk about that.